Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm Simon Carver here with Billy Galligan. And Billy, I need to start with a year that completely rerouted how I think about American history. 1500. Not 1776, not even 1620 with the Mayflower. We are talking the 1500s, when Irish soldiers were already walking the humid swamps of Spanish Florida as part of a colonial garrison.
Aye, the Spanish garrison. It sounds like the start of a bad joke, doesn't it? An Irishman, a Spaniard, and an alligator walk into a swamp. But it is a tell true. Long before the big yellow school buses or the skyscrapers existed, you had lads from Galway or Cork signing up with the Spanish crown. Sure, why not? If you are facing hard times at home, a Spanish ship heading to the New World looks like a grand adventure, even if you end up dodging arrows in St. Augustine.
It is wild to think about. And it wasn't just Florida. Between 1604 and the 1630s, there were actually Irishmen involved in trying to set up tobacco and sugarcane plantations in the Amazon region and early settlements in Newfoundland and Virginia. But the real volume of people starting in the 1620s didn't come as explorers or soldiers. They came as indentured servants. We are talking about thousands of young, mostly Catholic men trading up to 7 years of their lives for a boat ticket.
And that ticket was no luxury cruise, Simon. You are talking about packing into the hold of a wooden ship, sailing into the absolute unknown, and when you land in Virginia or Barbados, you do not get a welcoming committee. You get a master who owns your labor. It was a brutal system. If you survived the heat and the yellow fever, you might get a tiny patch of land at the end of it. But many of those poor fellas never saw their contract expire. They were worked right into the dirt.
And if the physical labour didn't break you, the legal system in some of these colonies would certainly try. Take colonial Virginia. They established the Anglican Church as the official state religion and passed incredibly restrictive laws against Catholic religious practices. You couldn't hold mass, you couldn't hold office, and in some years, you could even be fined just for refusing to attend Anglican services.
Imagine traveling thousands of miles across a terrifying ocean just to find the same old religious policing you thought you left behind in Ireland. But then you had Maryland. Cecil Calvert, the second Baron Baltimore, had a bit of sense. In 1639, the Maryland Assembly protected freedom of religion, and then they followed it up with the Toleration Act of 1649. By 1650, do you know how many Catholic churches with regular services existed in all the 8 British American colonies? Just 5, and every single one of them was in Maryland.
5 churches for the entire Catholic population of British America. That is a tiny footprint. But even that little bit of sanctuary didn't last. After the glorious revolution in England around 1689, Maryland, New York, Rhode Island and Carolina went right back to disenfranchising Catholics. In Maryland, they actually stripped Catholics of the right to vote, though they managed to get it restored by 1702. It was this constant, exhausting legal tug-of-war.
It was a heavy, heavy road for them. And it got worse. Around 1698 and 1699, Maryland, Virginia, and Carolina even passed laws specifically designed to limit the immigration of Irish Catholic indentured servants. They saw them as a security risk, a papist threat to their tidy little Protestant colonies. By the year 1700, out of a total Maryland population of around 29,600 people, only about 2,500 were Catholic. They were keeping a very close eye on the door.
But then, right as the 1700s got underway, the entire demographic character of Irish migration did this massive, dramatic pivot. It shifted from being primarily individual Catholic indentured servants to being overwhelmingly Protestant, mostly Presbyterians from the province of Ulster. And this wasn't just a trickle. Between 1717 and 1775, the most common estimate is that 250,000 Irish immigrants arrived in the 13 colonies. That is 250,000 people.
250,000. That is a massive wave of humanity. And these folks, the Ulster Presbyterians, they were leaving because they were caught in a terrible vice. They had been encouraged to settle in Ulster by the British Crown during the plantations, but then they got hit with massive rent hikes by landlord fellas who didn't care about their loyalties, and they faced severe discrimination under the Test Acts because they weren't Anglican. So they said, feck it, sure, why not? Let's cross the Atlantic.
What is really fascinating to me is how they migrated, compared to those early Catholic servants. The Catholic servants in the 1600s were mostly young, single men, arriving individually. But these Ulster Presbyterians in the 18th century migrated as entire families, sometimes even entire congregations with their ministers leading the way. They didn't want to blend into the established coastal cities. They headed straight for the rugged frontier.
They wanted room to breathe, and they wanted their own communities. They pushed right into the hills of Pennsylvania, down the Shenandoah Valley, and into the Carolinas. They brought their tight-knit family networks, their independent spirit, and of course, their Presbyterian churches. They were tough, stubborn people who knew how to clear a forest and defend a border. It is that frontier grit that created what people eventually started calling the Scotch-Irish identity.
Right, that Scotch-Irish label is so interesting because it's a term that really took off in America to distinguish these earlier, largely Protestant settlers from the massive waves of Irish Catholic famine immigrants who arrived in the mid-19th century. Historians point out that before the 1830s, Presbyterians actually made up the absolute majority of Irish immigrants to America. It is a completely different chapter to the story than the one most people learn in school.
It is a total shift in perspective. You go from individual lads working the tobacco fields of Virginia under strict Anglican laws to entire clans of Presbyterians building their own towns on the western edges of the colonies. They built the roads, they cleared the land, and they set up a network that would define the American interior for generations. They weren't just visiting, they were planting deep, permanent roots in the soil.
And those roots became incredibly influential very quickly. By the time the American Revolutionary War broke out in 1775, it is estimated that about 10% of the colonial population, around 400,000 people out of a total population of 3.9 million in 1790, claimed Irish birth or ancestry. 1 in 10 colonists.
1 in 10. Think about the weight of that. When the spark finally hit the gunpowder, those Irish lads did not sit on their hands. They had no love for the British Crown, especially the Ulster Presbyterians who remembered why they had been driven out of Ireland in the first place. When the call went out, they flooded into the Continental Army.
They really did. And we have concrete, heartbreaking proof of that from the very beginning of the conflict. At the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, there were 115 colonial soldiers killed. Of those, 22 were born in Ireland. That is nearly 20% of the colonial fatalities in one of the most famous early battles of the Revolution.
22 of them at Bunker Hill. Lads with names like Callahan, Casey, Collins, Connolly, Dillon, Donahue, Flynn, McGrath, Nugent, Shannon, and Sullivan. Those aren't just names on a page, Simon. Those are Irish names. Boys from back home who lay dead on a hill in Boston before the Declaration of Independence was even signed. They paid the ultimate price to build a new country.
It is incredibly sobering to hear those names listed out. It really drives home how deeply integrated the Irish were in the birth of the nation. By fighting and dying on the front lines, these early Irish immigrants forged a powerful claim to American identity. They weren't seen as outsiders looking in. They were recognised as the ones who helped build the house.
Absolutely. That wartime service changed everything for the Irish communities in America. It gave them a sense of ownership, a feeling of, we helped pay for this dirt with our blood. And that earned respect laid a foundation of acceptance that, even if it got tested severely in later generations when the famine waves arrived, could never be completely erased. They had proven their nerve on the battlefield.
It really reframes the whole narrative. We tend to think of Irish American history starting with the famine ships in 1845, but by the time those ships arrived, there was already a 200-year-old history of Irish contribution, struggle and sacrifice built into the very bricks of the nation. From Spanish Florida to the line at Bunker Hill, the Irish were already there.
They had already cleared the path and laid the tracks, even if the road ahead was still going to be a long, bumpy ride. It is a reminder that the story of America has always had a bit of Irish green woven into the very first threads.
Well said, Billy. That is all the time we have for today's episode. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time.
Slán highly, lads and lassies. Take care on the roads.